This is a doozy, folks. This is Tucker Carlson in Budapest. So Tucker Carlson went to Hungary and gave a speech on Hungary and about the values that America tries to prop up around the world and the values that it tries to shut down around the world. And he got into some pretty philosophical territory. I listened to the whole speech. I think it's worth listening to the whole speech. It's about 26 minutes. We're obviously not going to play all of it or even half of it. We're going to zero in on about 4 minutes where he talks about stuff that we've talked about earlier on in this stream. For people who are watching the clipped version of this, kind of existential, philosophical musings about what American life has become, the difference between city life and country life, differences between material wealth and spiritual health and wealth, I would say. And the fact that, as he says at the opening, our political class doesn't even pretend to want to make our lives more enriching anymore.
The people running the United States are no longer even pretending to offer a better life to the people who live there, which is a huge change. I mean, throughout the course of my life until fairly recently, we had people I voted for in office, people I would never vote for in office, but all of them made basically the same promise. Elect me, give me power, and I will make your life better. And here's how I'll do it. I never hear anybody make that case in the United States. And what they're offering is a world in which human flourishing is, if not impossible, very difficult. The ruling party is the party of the childless, the unmarried, the people who are working for low wages for large corporations and living in tiny apartments in overcrowded cities that are rife with crime. That's not a cliche, that's true. It's not a talking point. It's true. Who votes for the people who run the United States right now? People who are, again, working for big nonprofits or big banks, living in crowded conditions, very often alone, in big soulless cities, having their food delivered by...
Yeah, right. Talking about me?
It's almost like he's been following me around with a camera.
Yeah, I should have thought about this when I sent this to Russell. Said I should have put a trigger warning on the text message there.
I'm very triggered.
Yeah.
Well, play it through and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, we can play it through.
Immigrants and spending their time glued to a screen. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like prison, actually. It sounds like prison. When people violate our laws in the United States, how do we punish them? Well, we execute a few, not very many. But mostly, our harshest punishment is locking them in a small cell where they can't see the sky, where their food is delivered through the bars, often by immigrants, from the commissary, which is the Uber Eats of prison, where they have to sit cut off from nature and in solitude for years. Well, that's the life of your average Democratic voter. Solitude, isolation, cut off from nature. Who are the people who oppose this? And some of them are Republicans. You're not going to hear me say word one in support of the Republicans, by the way, who have collaborated in the most dishonorable possible way with the Biden administration. So instead of saying Republican, I will describe them as anyone who's not with the program, which is the majority of people in my country. Where do they live? And more important, how do they live? Well, they're poorer generally on paper, but are their lives worse? If you live in a place where you can see the sky, where you can make your own food and maybe even know where it comes from, if you can go outside and say identify 3 species of trees or hear birds or experience silence, the rarest commodity in the modern world, silence, where you can hear voices that aren't being broadcast from NBC News or Google, maybe higher voices, those are the people who are not with the program. People who have a daily experience of others and who have a daily experience of nature. And those people are much more likely to acknowledge a power beyond themselves and beyond their government. And there's a reason for that, because they can see it. When you're isolated in a cell, living, as the urban planners of the United States now refer to it as, in density, which is somehow supposed to be good for the climate or the world. No, it's death. It's enslavement is what it is. When you're living crowded as you would on an industrial farm as a cow or as a chicken in a pen, you are not liberated, you are enslaved, and you can't think clearly, and your reference points are gone, and you can't see the stars, and you can't see the trees, you cannot see God's creation. All around you, you see what? Drywall and screens made by other people, people who don't mean you well, and your ability to make clear judgments, to think clearly, to think rationally goes away. And the next thing you know, you're still wearing a COVID mask 3 years later. Because how would you know not to?
Okay. All right. So this is yet another case where up is down, left is right, and everything is topsy-turvy. Because this speech could have been given by some hippie starting a commune in 1967. That is this very back to nature. We live in a very artificial society that warps our perception of reality. And you have to get back to nature because that's where you'll find, you know, the hippies weren't fond of the term God, life force, Gaia, you know, whatever term they might have used. But yeah, I mean, that's this very anti-modern kind of a diatribe that he went on there. If you look at the whole thing, it actually made me curious about his religious views. He's an Episcopalian, but he feels that the Episcopalian Church, there was one clip he had that was kind of made the rounds because some people speculated it was part of why they fired him from Fox, because he described the Episcopalian Church as barely Christian anymore. I assume what he means is they've gone too far left or gotten too much into left culture war kind of things. But he speaks also, it's really, if you want to understand where Tucker Carlson is coming from, that speech really articulates his entire worldview about diplomacy, about politics, about modern life, about culture and social mores. And, you know, he is definitely, you know, a conservative. He praises Reagan in that speech. But he also, as is often the case with Carlson, as is the case with that segment, he says a lot of things that make a lot of sense. Some things that he brings up that, you know, the left does have a hard time with was he says that the administration hates your country identifying as Christian. And he said, you know, and he says, personally, I don't have a problem with, say, Indonesia is mostly Muslim, identifying as Muslim, but why can you uniquely not identify as Christian? And you know what? I mean, there's some validity and some truth to that, particularly given that he's framing it within a kind of non-intervention in other people's culture, foreign policies, kind of like what China is doing. He basically articulates, well, it's not our business in our diplomacy to tell other countries what they should do or what their values are. The purpose of diplomacy is to persuade a country to align with our interests. The rest of it is not relevant to what we're doing. And he was specifically talking about, and I looked it up, there is some basis to this. We have a gay ambassador there who's really needling them about their policies around LGBTQ rights. You know, now you might feel good. Okay, I don't see us do that in Saudi Arabia. Do we go to the Saudi Arabia and insist on, apparently, like he basically trolled the country that he's the ambassador to by having a big pride event in Hungary. Okay, I mean, you might agree with that, but okay, would you agree with doing it in a Muslim country? So he brings out what I would argue is a hypocrisy around that. It does seem like the one thing you can't identify as is Christian. Like, it's not as if we have a blanket problem with countries identifying with a particular religious alignment. It's only a Christian alignment that we seem to have an issue with.
Well, he mentioned Russia as well.
He did.
He mentioned how, you know, a lot of negativity towards Russia has to do with their socially more conservative views that are sort of informed by the Christian faith. And, you know, this is something that gets brought up a lot about Putin's attitude towards gay people, right? I mean, you hear that brought up in passing a lot. And it's not a point to bring up in passing so much, because a lot of this global realignment has to do with which countries deserve access to international markets and which countries do not. So you're basically seeing this like globalist sort of ESG scheme where every country, every society gets a certain ESG score. And those who score well are invited into the club, and those who don't are not. Russia, throughout its history, has been the odd man out in that way. They remained Orthodox when much of Europe went Catholic. And so they've always been kind of seen as this relic of the past and not with the program. Tucker even used that exact phrase, with the program, right? And you could apply that internationally. You could apply that domestically here. But that bit about life in the city versus life in the country, the people who are pulling the strings, and by pulling the strings, we're not talking about, you know, next level conspiratorial shit. We're just talking about the people voting for the people in power. That's what he said. Who votes for the people who run the country? Well, at this moment, it's people in the cities. And these people tend to be a lot wealthier on paper, but how do they live? A lot of them are unmarried, childless, isolated, glued to a screen, locked in a cell in a poorly lit apartment where they can't see the sky very well. And he compares that to a prison, and then he compares, you know, what we can loosely refer to as the deplorables, right? The people who are not with the program, as materially a lot worse off, but spiritually a lot better off, because they're not plugged in all the time. They can see the sky. They can identify the trees. They're more in touch with the actual world than the people who, looking at it from 30,000 feet, you would think would be so much happier because they have so much more power. But do they seem happier? Do these PMC libs seem happy? They seem fucking miserable. They're completely humorless. They're droll. They're boring. They're uninteresting. Right. The art they create sucks. The art they consume sucks, right? Like, what lives are they actually leading?
They're very denatured.
Exactly. You posted I think it was on your Facebook, the other day, the Bob Dylan quote, which I've seen multiple times. What's money? A man is a success if he wakes up in the morning, goes to bed at night, and in between does what he wants to do. Well, who's richer in that sense, really? You know, he raises that question. That's a very important philosophical question to ask. It's also a very important political question, because the people who have the most power, the people whose voices count most in the society, are people who are not creating good lives even for themselves. And I connect this to the rent control segment, because you have landlords who are now waiting, chomping at the bit, hoping the Supreme Court lifts the rent regulations. Why? So they can charge more for the apartment? That's going to completely destroy the actual quality of life in your community for everybody, not just the people who get evicted, but the people who enjoy New York for what it is, this great cultural center. You're willing to completely gut that for $1. To what end? To what actual end are you willing to do that? You're going to be more miserable as a result of that, but you're willing to do it anyway. So there's this very self-destructive streak amongst politically connected people right now, which speaks to an overall rot in the system. What is it hurtling towards? What is it building towards? These people don't really have an answer for that. The people in power have no answer for that. The people who are not with the program have a better answer for that, in the sense that they find meaning in what's around them, because, as you said, they're more in touch with the real world, with the natural world, with people around them. Tucker Carlson does not own a TV in his home, which is amazing, because the guy made his living in TV. He does not have a TV.
Did you do the math on he's been with his wife for 39 years? That means he met her when he was 15.
Yeah.
I didn't know that either.
I knew he married very
since
young.
He's 15.
I knew he married very young. I didn't know.
Well,
was
apparently they started dating. Well,
high school sweethearts, right?
I'm sure they didn't marry when he was 15.
no, sounds like
But he said he's
yeah.
been with his wife for 39 years, and he's 54.
Right.
So yeah, they started dating when he was 15. So, you know, and this is part of what I saw too, listening to everything that he was saying. You know, there are a lot of people on the left who, you know, and it goes back to the Oliver Anthony thing too. I would say that Oliver Anthony is closer to the left than the left some people who consider themselves left want to admit, whereas with Tucker it's more complicated. Like, he clearly I don't think Oliver Anthony would praise Reagan. I'd be surprised based on other things he said. Yeah, man, I mean, he's a conservative, but it's more complicated than that. And I thought something that he said that was very interesting that explains why Tucker has evolved, whereas none of his peers that I can think of have. He describes a philosophy of humility that is very much something that you would get if you were a believer of Christianity, and you know, truly a believer, not a mock virtue signaling believer, like a true believer. Yeah, I mean, Christianity is very built around being humble and having humility. And he spends a lot of time talking about that and talking about how you should have the humility not to assume that you know everything about the argument on the other side with someone you disagree with or someone else's situation. And he applies it to nations. That's part of his rationale for we shouldn't interfere with the internal culture of another nation. He uses the metaphor of a marriage, that when a marriage splits up, a lot of people will say, oh, well, clearly the husband was this or the wife was that, but really you don't know. And he says, if you don't even understand what goes on inside another person's marriage, how can you understand what goes on inside another person's country? Listen, you could debate him, but that's not a monstrous observation. That's essentially what I came away with. There are things he said there that I did not agree with, but he also said we should be able to disagree, and I should have the humility to realize I don't know everything, and maybe the person I'm disagreeing with is right. And clearly he practiced what he preached, because why is he the only one of his whole Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity set to evolve? Clearly he has evolved. He is not the same Tucker Carlson of 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think he really understood the Trump movement. He understood Trump's populist appeal in ways that a lot of his peers only kind of pretended to, because they have a finger in the wind and they realize that, okay, now if we're going to get paid to back Trump, we'll do that. But, you know, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, these guys are just reading the fucking prompter. They don't really have much going on in the brain.
Right.
He obviously does. He was, if you look at his old clips on Crossfire during the Iraq War, he started out an Iraq War zealot. He was a neocon stooge.
I remember. Yeah.
You know, so he obviously did undergo a genuine transformation of sorts. And I think because he's just smart, you know, he obviously has a real brain. He has a certain curiosity that a lot of his peers lack. I can't imagine Sean Hannity thinks about politics in his spare time. I imagine Sean Hannity shows up to work. Okay, what's on the prompter today? Okay, I'll read enough backstory so I could do the interview, and then I'll go home, and he's watching football. Tucker, like I said, does not own a TV. He's not plugged in this way. You know, he's not on social media all that much. Now he posts his show there, but he's not a constant presence online, right? And so, you know, I think he's a person who has a lot more intellectual and psychological and philosophical depth than a lot of people in his space. And I think what he realized in 2016 was that whether you agree with a person or not is less important than whether that disagreement matters. Because once the political establishment just runs roughshod over the population and implements their will, at that point, our political disagreements don't matter because we can't influence anything anyway. And I think Tucker really rebelled against that in a real way. And I think that's part of what we try to do here on the show. That's part of why I thought this speech was so good, and part of why he's been so useful, despite the fact that I disagree with him pretty strongly on a large number of issues. He is a populist, not in the material sense. He's obviously a rich kid who grew up wealthy, and I see some people going on in the Rumble chat here and in the YouTube chat, not a lot in the speech about monopolies and deindustrialization.
Right.
True, fair enough.
Yeah,
absolutely.
He's a conservative.
Right. So all that, yes.
He's not a leftist.
No, he's not a leftist, but he's also, I mean, he's talked to, in that famous interview with Ben Shapiro, he's talked about how he would regulate self-driving trucks out of existence so that we can protect the jobs for workers, even though it's anti-capitalist, right? So he's not a doctrinaire Reaganite anymore. No. Part of the speech was about how Reaganism has kind of become obsolete as time has moved on.
That was, when he, even as he praised Reagan, he said, it's no longer applicable to our times. Right.
But I think most importantly, what he feels is that we need to get back to a political paradigm where the debates that we have actually matter, where the debates that we have actually can influence political decision making, because he has it in his head, rightfully so, that right now they just can't.
Right. And he didn't use the term postmodernism, but he attacked the kinds of debates we're having, because he said, well, if you're having a debate where you think, more money should go to the working class and somebody else thinks there should be tax cuts for the rich, all right, you're a Keynesian and you're Milton Friedman, right? That's a debate we can have, and where we all have the same goal, right? We're trying to make a society where everybody's prosperous. And he said the debates we're having now, they don't have a goal of making people's lives better. They're just nonsense.
Right.
They're not based in anything.
Please clap.